Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, so today this project was, well, I presented it before in the science seminar, but it was very short, condensed one. So I guess today I thought it was a good place to present so that I can expand upon explanations of certain things. But yeah, let me first start with a bit of an origin story. So this was actually a fun side project during the PhD that I started together with some of my friends back pre-COVID 2019, yeah, it so happens that there were three nerds: Maz, Polly, and Martin Flatterer from Technical University of Munich. We were at the Chris seminar. There was a certain guest from the US, and they were giving a talk about, I think it was leader hypocrisy, something like that. And then he was making a lot of claims and arguments and conclusions that were really weird. And so the three of us, we were just like, what is going on here? And then we thought this was a problem. And then at the same time, we were sort of bored of our PhD research, and we just came together and like, okay, let's do something fun. And this is how the project came to fruition. So this is just a shout out to the PhD students around here. You know, if you want to do something fun, this is an example of what could occur when you guys come to the seminars and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so the project today that we're talking about has become a paper. It's entitled "Fish Can Rot from the Heart, Not Just the Head: Exploring the Detrimental Impact of Transgressions by Leaders at Multiple Levels of an Organization," and collaboration between UQ and TUM. It's now accepted in the British Journal of Social Psychology. So back then, the hype was to try and do a open science hype. And so we tried the register report. We went through the whole stage 1, stage 2 process and so on. Yeah, so now it's there. I guess the agenda for me today, my purpose today, is trying to figure out, this work is actually a seminal work of a larger research program that we're trying to develop for a grant. And so, today I'm hoping that some of the brightest minds here, you could tell me if you have any ideas or suggestions of possible interesting directions that we could go towards that could help in our development of the program. Yeah. Okay, so a bit of a background to orientate everyone. Okay, this is in the field of leadership. You know that the academic subject of leadership is humongous, and it has a long history, right? But it is only pretty recently that the field of bad leadership actually came to fruition, became prominent in about the early 2000s with the work by Barbara Kellerman from Harvard University. And then at the same time, the field of leadership underwent a sort of crisis similar to the psychology crisis that we had. So around 2018, 2019, we were all like, there was a lot of questions and criticisms about the leadership theories that we have, the studies that we've done, and all the papers that we've written. But let's focus specifically on bad leadership. So this particular field, it had a lot of problems as well. And one of the problems that it has was most of the analysis tend to focus so much on top-ranking leaders in society, specifically like CEOs, celebrities, politicians, top military leaders, and so on. And it sort of like begs the question, I mean, if you see these people, they are like very high-ranking people in society. They're so far away from the average person. Do they actually affect people that much? I mean, yeah, sure, they grab attention, but what about the everyday leaders that we have around us, our supervisors, our managers, and so on? Why don't we pay attention to them as well, right? And at the same time, the analysis tend to be, well, acontextual. I was going to put simplistic. I previously put simplistic, but that's a bit, not too nice to say. But essentially, what I mean by this is that they look at a company, they draw a circle around a company, and then they identify the bad leader per se, and then they analyze the entire situation as if the company is a simple, single-level, homogeneous group structure, right? But we know that companies tend to be more complex than that. It tends to have a lot of, you can say, nested groups. So within a company, you can have different divisions, and within those divisions, different departments have different teams and work groups as well. And within all these subgroups, it tends to have their own leaders. You got your supervisors, your team leaders, your directors, and so on. Great. So considering this, the leaders at different levels of the organization, if you were a worker, whose bad behavior would actually affect you the most? Is it the CEO, the distal organizational leader, who you would meet only like once or twice a year? Or is it the day-to-day leader who is more immediate, like your manager or your team leader who interacts with you more frequently? And let's assume both of them have an effect on you. What are the differences in the impact of their bad behavior on you as a worker? So that's the question that we try to investigate here. Now, before we move further, we have to clarify the formal definition of things. We can't say bad leadership per se, because bad is a very, you can say, big term, broad term, informal term that can mean a few things. Here we are talking about leader behaviors that violate group norms in harmful and unacceptable ways. Now, I underline that because some scholars might argue that isn't that just deviance, leader deviance from the norms. But it's important to be precise here, because deviance can sometimes be good as well. Because we know that in studies that deviance in the form of, say, creativity, innovation, things that try to break the status quo for the betterment of the group, that can actually be good, right? So yeah, that's why we try to differentiate from deviance altogether. Now, fundamental, theoretical, and empirical basis. Our line of work refers to three main streams of research. First stream, obviously, is the work on social identification, where it is the process where a person's self-concept is structured by their sense of group membership. So just like how your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and motivations could be informed and guided by your membership with UQ, or with a football team, or as an employee with an organization, right? Okay, then related to this, there is a line of work, a long history of work on nested groups and identities, actually, looking at the differences in identification and salience or effects of the subgroups within a larger group. So for example, what Naomi, Elmes, and Ashworth, they all found that the smaller group tends, the smaller subgroup, say for example, a team or your work group, tends to be more salient, deemed as more important to you and closer to you compared to, say, the larger organization. Just like how you would identify more closely with CBOP compared to the larger UQ, or it could be the other way around. It's not always the case, but tends to be when it comes to employment-wise. Yeah, that tends to be the case. Then there's the work on leader transgressions, where generally transgressive leaders tend to have a negative impact. That's a given. But more specifically, you could say, transgressive leaders tend to diminish followers' judgments of the leader's effectiveness. It could increase perceptions of threat to their group. It could also decrease identification, and then in Oak-Psych speak, it would affect retention and turnover. So increase the probability of turnover in a group, in a company. Okay, great. So the predictions that we have, we've got 3 DVs. I'll explain them later, but and also in writing, it was rather complex. So I try to make it in a more visual format here. So imagine this is a representation of a 2-level company. And then this is you as the follower, as the worker. And then the smaller circle here is considered like your work group, your work team, and the larger circle here is considered the organization that encompasses the work team. And then the people with the flag here, they are your leaders at the respective levels. Now the color here is relevant as well, because the blue coloring represents your level of identification with the respective group levels. So ceteris paribus, in normal circumstances, we would expect a baseline level of identification at both the work group and organizational level. But what happens when we start to introduce a leader transgression? So here, let's say the organizational leader transgresses, we predict a work group protection effect. So what I mean by this, okay, generally, let's follow the trends from past research. Trends from past research say that the transgression at a particular level tends to affect events and experiences and judgments of that same level. And that's why we get this, the fading. You can see the fading of the outer ring there. The organizational level leader commits a transgression, affects the organizational identification. But then we expect that because the work group is closer to you, it's more salient to you in your eyes, therefore you are motivated to protect it, and therefore you maintain your identification with that group. Now, but what happens if there's a work group leader transgression? So again, following past research, we would expect that the work group leader transgression to impact your identification at the work group level. But then here's the interesting thing, because the work group is closer to you, it tends to be the thing that influences your view of the world. It colors your view of the outer world. And therefore, you know, it will color your perception of the organizational level as well. And that's why you see fading of the color in, you know, both levels. Great. So how do we test this? We were trying to figure out something fun to do, a different way of trying to test this. So it so happens that at that point in time, I was crazy and addicted on this multiplayer Xbox game called Overcooked. It's a multiplayer game. It requires a lot of teamwork, and it actually causes a lot of arguments and competition between couples and between housemates and things like that. But why? Because it actually, you when you play this game, you're put into a particular role as in within a kitchen team. So let's say this is a kitchen team, and then you have like all these orders coming in, and then you have ingredients that you gotta prepare in order to cook that meal. So one person will have to be on the one side of the kitchen to take the ingredients, and another person has to go and prep the ingredients, and another one has to cook. And then you guys got to like shuffle around and serve and cross over each other and things like that. So it's a mess. But essentially, we were thinking, okay, that's pretty actually one way we could create a realistic but artificial environment when you want to do an experiment. So yeah, but at the same time, this was our original concept idea and plan. We had a graphics designer, but you know, science being boring, we had to all these extraneous variables that you got to consider. You had to simplify. In the end, it became a typical like online Qualtrics experiment. Yeah, I'll elaborate later. Okay, so this is the overview of the entire procedure. A lot of information. I'm just gonna skip the details. What is important to know is that we had about 5 or 6 stages, and then there's a pre-intervention, pre-exposure portion where we measure some of the variables before the exposure, and then after that there's a post-exposure portion, which is where we measure post-intervention variables. Great. So overall, we recruited 360 participants. Power analysis indicated that we just needed 334. But you know, there's going to be like bad results and bad responses. And we found that indeed only 322 qualified for final analysis. We recruited via MTurk, but everyone knows that MTurk is problematic in terms of the kind of the quality of participants. And so we had to embed this pretty cool, you could say, application or the new company called Cloud Research, which helps to actually filter out bad participants in MTurk and only filter in good quality participants. They have a certain like filtration process, and yeah, it makes it a bit more expensive, but we found that it was pretty good. You know, it's in addition to, you know, certain efforts by Prolific and all that. So you can see there's some studies comparing the quality of participants between Cloud Research, MTurk, and Prolific. Great. So let me put you through the shoes of a participant. So when you get into the study, what you do is you are taking on the role of a junior cook who aspires to be a chef one day, like Gordon Ramsay. And then you have been applying for jobs, and suddenly you get offers by 2 restaurants, Walk the Talk and Just Do Eat, very fancy names. And then you got to choose one of them. And then so you after that you get to meet the organizational leader, Alex, the restaurant manager. After you meet the restaurant manager, You get to choose the team in which you can work with, either team alfalfa or team beetroot. And after you choose the team you meet B, you interact with the team leader, Sam. Now, the entire principle behind this is actually following the classic self-assignment minimal groups paradigm, where the premise is that, if you voluntarily get to choose the team and group that you work with or join, you tend to identify with that group more compared to when you are like assigned a group. Right. And somehow, I was thinking when I read up on this, I never did this before. When I read up on this, I was like, does that really work? But somehow we did 3 pilots and it worked every time we compared the manipulation, and somehow it works. So that's amazing. Classic studies can surprise you sometimes. And yeah, so this is the task that we did. So again, following like the principles from Overcooked, you got the timer, the order comes in over there, and then you have to scroll down and quickly look at the ingredients required for that particular order, and then you go to the items. You got to quickly like sort them out into the ingredients tray in the correct order before the customers get mad. And so you do this like about 3 rounds or so before, and then suddenly you will encounter a scenario where you see your leader walking out with a tray of potatoes. This is a bit of this is like the 2x2 condition, exposure condition, where, you are either seeing Alex, the restaurant manager, the organizational leader, or Sam, the team leader. And the transgression is essentially they will accidentally drop the potatoes, and then they quickly pick up the potatoes, 3-second rule, and then after that, serve it to the customer, right? And so that's a clear transgression. But the normative condition would be they'll take potatoes, throw it out, and serve a new plate of potatoes. Great. So what happens next? All right. So during all that, we have 3 main DVs: identification, both at the organizational and the team level, pre and post. Leader effectiveness only measured post. We will do a between groups comparison between the normal and the transgressive condition group. For the organizational leader and the team leader. And in-role performance, it's measured by time it takes to complete the task, pre and post. We compare them and using an ANCOVA. All right, so let's go through the findings for each DV. When it comes to identification, our predictions were semi-supported. We did find an upward coloring effect. So the workgroup leader transgression didn't just affect identification at the workgroup level. We found that it affected people's identification at the organizational level. So great. Well, not so great for the organization, but yeah. And but we did not find a significant workgroup protection effect. This could be, essentially the organizational leader transgression continued to affect both the organizational level and the workgroup level. So explanation for this, we were thinking, okay, it's either because of the outliers, because we sort of found that our results, our hypothesis we were closer to the hypothesis when we excluded outliers. Also, it could be because the level of identification, participants couldn't really differentiate between the work group and the organizational level really well. They were too close together. So you could think that the kitchen team is the restaurant. And so because of that distinction, maybe that affected the lack of distinction. Great. So for perceived leader effectiveness, predictions were supported fully. So we had an upward coloring effect. Workgroup leader transgression affected people's perceptions and ratings of the organizational leader. Whereas the workgroup protection, whereas we've also found a workgroup protection effect, where the organizational leader transgression did not affect your perceptions of the work group. So taken together, you could see that from the, say, for example, a CEO or organizational leader's perspective, it's a bit, perceptions of yourself is actually impacted by people's perceptions of, say, lower level leaders and managers and so on, which is, but not the other way around. Great. So, and then work performance. What we found, again, was our prediction was supported. We found that work group leader transgression did slow down performance, but organizational leader transgression did not affect performance. You see, and yeah, again, in the literature, it backs up our argument that in the literature, we pay so much attention to the higher ranking leader, But the people that matter are the people in the lower level, in the lower levels, the leaders in the lower levels. Limitations and future directions. Some of the things that came out of this were, well, we noticed, again, back to the measuring of the identification, we sort of realized it's only 2 levels. And could it be that these 2 levels were not enough to create that sort of like social distance between the work group and the organizational level? So maybe what happens if we add one more layer in between? Could that increase the salience in difference between the levels of the subgroups? Another one is, what if there are differences in identification between the nested levels? So here we sort of started out with a baseline where there was a roughly equal amount of identification between the work group and the organizational level. But we know in past research that if there are differences in identification, say it actually affects whether you are satisfied with the overall company or whether you would commit to extra role behaviors, for example. And naturally, if you identify with both levels equally, the more committed you are to the entire organization. So in that sense, could that be a protective factor? If we manipulate that, maybe that prevents or that moderates the effect of leader transgressions on you, possibly. What if you use a more demanding task? Okay, the task that we did was essentially pretty simple in a sense that you just had to sort ingredients within under time pressure. But what if it's a bit more cognitively demanding, like something that requires you to understand the semantics of things, to prioritize things within the time condition? If all those leads to cognitive load, perhaps could maybe drastically exaggerate the effects that we found. Yeah, those are the 3 ones that we were thinking of right now. But then I'm happy to hear if you have any more suggestions for that. In conclusion, there's this common adage that a fish rots from the head down. When there's a problem in the group, it's usually because of the leader. What we find is that it's not just the bad behavior at the top that matters. It's also the bad behavior of hidden leaders within, when you consider a multi-level organization, that can have a damaging impact on workers. So essentially, the fish can also rot from its heart. Thank you.